In my opinion, horror lives in the short form, and in my opinion, you can make almost any horror movie better by making it shorter. I think most horror fans would agree that modern day Hollywood horror is often weighted down with needless backstory and needless filler scenes. And I was sort of anticipating the same thing when I went to see Sinners. It had over a 2 hour runtime, and that made me nervous. So when I tell you that I walked away with a very different feeling than usual. So yeah, I think Sinners should have been a trilogy. And I know that's crazy. I know that wishing for horror movie sequels is usually a bad bet. And I also know that in the era of splitting every freaking adaptation into multiple volumes just for the sake of studios making more money is annoying. But every so often, there's a movie that really deserves to have more of its story told. There are characters that deserve to have more screen time, and there are messages that deserve more prominence. And that's why I've been giving so much thought to why Sinners should have been a trilogy. First, I'd just like to do a little tangent about horror movie sequels. See, I'm sure you're all familiar with the phenomenon of having one really popular movie and then having a whole bunch of sequels that seemingly have very little, if not nothing, to do with the original. That's actually by design. If you're a film buff, you already know this, but if not, let me clue you in. What happens is that studios like making money, but they don't like taking risks. Those two things actually kind of go hand in hand. So, when they get a script that they like, but they're concerned about how much money it will make, especially in horror, because horror just, well, there's a whole discussion to be had there, but basically horror isn't as marketable because it can't be shown to all ages, and theater restrictions, and censorship laws, and that's another discussion for another time. The point is that sometimes studio executives will see a script that they really want, but they're not confident they can market it on its own merits. So they find another horror movie, a successful one, with enough similarities that they can reasonably pass it off as a sequel or a prequel or what have you. And that is why we get movies like The Blair Witch Project 2 Book of Shadows, which has almost nothing to do with the original. I only saw it once. Actually, an example of this phenomenon working out well is the Saw franchise, and say what you will about those movies, but there wasn't supposed to be a second. James Wan really only wanted to make the original Saw, and then a studio executive who saw big dollar signs in their eyes couldn't convince James Wan, but did find a script by someone named Darren Lynn Bousman that everyone had said was way too similar to Saw, so they took it and they slapped the Saw name on it. And actually, Saw 2 is a pretty good movie, but I digress. Back to Sinners. I think the craziest thing about this opinion I have on Sinners is that the movie is nearly 2.5 hours long. Normally, a movie that long would have plenty of time to do everything it wanted, and often movies that long have way too much space to do things that we didn't even need. Sinners, however, at 2 hours and 20 or so minutes, I can't think of a single moment of wasted screen time. I can't imagine anything I would cut. However, there is so much more to tell. I think that there are actually 3 distinct stories in the movie Sinners. However, I wouldn't necessarily split up the movies each individual story. I think the best way to do it would be the way that they cut together the Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers movie. That book is divided into 2 separate sections, The Fellowship and Sam and Frodo. It's split right down the middle. However, in the movie, they obviously cut back and forth between them, and so I think that that's sort of the rhythm you would want to have for this trilogy. Someone much smarter and better at movies than me would have to make that kind of decision. I also just want to say that before I started making this video, I thought it was important to go out and find reviews and opinion pieces from people of color on this movie, specifically Black Americans. As you can tell, I am whiter than the vampires in the movie, so I wanted to make sure that I wasn't missing anything, and also that I was elevating voices who understand a lot more than I do. I will be naming the authors who I reference, and I will also be linking the pieces that I refer to in the description. If you haven't already seen Sinners, please stop this video and go see it. See it in the theater, catch all that beautiful cinematic detail. This is your spoiler warning, so here we go. If you've seen the movie, I think you would agree with me that the three distinct stories are the story of Preacher Boy Sammy, of Smokestack Twins, and of the music and the power therein. So first, let's talk about Preacher Boy Sammy. I think the movie missed an opportunity regarding the guitar. Sammy, of course, is the character who is the conduit of magic in this movie, and so I'm not concerned about how he was characterized. That was great. In the end, Sammy resists getting rid of the guitar because he thinks it belonged to a blues legend, but it's revealed that it only just belonged to the twins' father. I understand that in the movie, the idea is sort of the magic potion, you know, the power was within you all along, and in this case, the power was very much within Sammy. However, the guitar is still important, and I think this because the twins' father, who owned the guitar, was obviously the preacher's brother. The preacher disapproves of Sammy playing the blues. I'm sure anyone who's grown up in a Christian community can relate to how there's a moral panic about the devil's music every generation or so. What's interesting to me is that as much as the preacher disapproves of the blues music that Sammy clearly loves playing, he kept the guitar. He preserved his brother's guitar. And sure, I guess you could make the argument that it had more to do with the sentimentality of his brother than the music, but I don't think anything in this movie is by accident. I think it's significant that the preacher kept the guitar that was then used by his son to conduct literal magic throughout time. Don't you think that that aspect of the story deserved a little more attention? I mean, what was the relationship between the preacher and his brother like? What turned the preacher so heavily away from music when his brother loved it? What made the preacher keep that guitar in perfect working condition for Sammy if he didn't want him to play it? I feel like there's something there, and I would have liked to see it explored. The point I'd like to make about Sammy and the ending is best put, I think, by Dr. Amanda Davis-Buie, whose essay I pulled this excerpt from. Quote, "One of the most moving moments. The young man chose not to give up his music. He stayed true. He played the blues all his life. Yet, he said the happiest moment of his life was that one night at the juke joint. Why didn't more happiness follow? If he made the right choice, why did it never feel as good again?" As I mentioned, I'm going to link the entire essay in the description. The second major story is, of course, the Smokestack Twins. These characters were so interesting. There was so much going on, clearly so much history, and they were arguably just as much of main characters as Sammy was. They deserved more time. And I know that that's crazy, again, to say about a 2.5-hour movie, but they did. We know that they grew up with Sammy. We know that they were in some kind of war. We know that they moved to Chicago, and we know some of the reasons why. What I think is interesting is, why did they come back when it seems like it was pretty clearly established that they both had reasons for leaving the South behind forever? I'm not saying that it's wrong. I liked the story. I think it's important that the reason that they give for coming back from Chicago is that Black men aren't actually any more free in Chicago than they were in the South. But what does that mean for their story? I mean, if Black men aren't free anywhere, then why didn't they go to anywhere else in the States? If they both had such good reasons for leaving. What exactly pulled them back? If they were going to steal from the Irish and the Italians to make a bunch of money like they did, why go where people know that their families live? Again, nothing in this movie happened by accident. I don't think so. The way I feel about the Smokestack Twins is that a whole bunch of doors were just cracked ajar, and yeah, okay, you don't really need to look into every room to get a sense of who they are or their importance to the story, but I definitely am curious, and I'd like to know. The third story, of course, is the music, and more importantly, the power to use music to bring back spirits from all throughout time. And yes, that scene right in the middle of the movie where you get to see all the different time periods is absolutely incredible. I know why they didn't have the budget to keep doing that for the entire movie. However, the impression I got from the opening narration is that there's something evil about this power. It gave me the impression that you're not supposed to use this power, that people have it, but that it's more of a curse than a gift. Maybe I interpreted that completely incorrectly. The idea of the musical power being inherently evil is an interesting one, and even though it doesn't seem inherently evil when it's used, it definitely does seem, based on the vampire's reaction, that it can be used for evil purposes. I think this ties back nicely, actually, to my point about the preacher and the preacher's brother who owned the guitar. When I first saw the movie, in fact, I kind of thought that the reason why it hurt the vampire when Sammy hit him upside the head with it was because the guitar had been blessed by the preacher. I kind of assumed that there was something there with, keeping the brother safe. Of course, it actually turns out that I'm just a silly person and it was because the silver thing on the guitar. But anyway, the other key thing about the musical power is that it's kind of the driving force behind the vampires. The vampires wouldn't even show up there if it weren't for Sammy. They want Sammy specifically because they're trapped between worlds, and Sammy's power allows them to see the people who have moved on. I love that. That's an awesome idea. I have another quote here from theroot.com, and I believe that it very nicely encapsulates the kind of exploration that I would like to see from the musical power. Quote, "It is not by mistake that the horror begins right after the scene that showcases black music. The vampires are white people who are attracted to the power of black music. Remick, the chief vampire, is willing to let everyone live if the people inside the club would hand over Sammy." And that is from Professor Lawrence Ware at theroot.com. It will be linked in the description. I think Professor Ware makes a great point about the power of black music, and I just think that I would have liked to see more about that. I think that it could have been easily interwoven back between all the different characters' threads. Now, I know I just read that quote from Professor Ware that said the vampires are white people, and I don't think that that's an incorrect take. I would just like to offer you another take. And it's not even one that I can explain particularly well because I'm not a historian. However, I just observed that I think that it's interesting that in the movie, the vampire is being portrayed by Irish immigrants hunting black Americans. You have two marginalized communities feeding off of each other while the people in power, specifically the white people, are making off with the entire cake, lying, and plotting to destroy all of them. I just think there's something to chew on there. While we're on the subject of marginalized communities, I'd just like to make a note of something else that I think could benefit in this movie from expanding in the trilogy plot structure, and that's the Native American vampire hunters. I do think that it's a little bit reductionist, potentially verging on racist, to suggest that all Native American characters are symbolic of protecting and nurturing and caring for the land. However, in vampire mythology specifically, vampires are sort of the antithesis of the natural, right? They're undead. So in the case of this specific movie, I do feel comfortable saying that I would have liked to see more about the story of the native vampire hunters and what kind of history they have. I think that that honestly could probably be its whole own movie, but if we're sticking to the story that we have, I still think that that could make an extremely strong B-plot. I'd just like to close out this video with a quote from the incomparable Lauren Bobby Penn Williams and the symbolism of that catchy song, Pick Poor Robin Clean. Quote, "The song Pick Poor Robin Clean is deep. The Robin is us, Black America, and the people picking at us is everyone who benefits from our culture, our talent, our bodies, without ever protecting our souls." I will be linking her video in the description as well. And that's why I think that Sinners should be a trilogy. That is the first and probably only time I will ever openly wish for horror movie sequels, or for any movie to be split into multiple parts.